What's going on, guys? Welcome back into the channel. Today I'm actually doing a follow-up video on one of my previous videos where we discussed true player value in Madden 20 and how you may be valuing players incorrectly based off of the fact that some players are imbalanced. You'll oftentimes see a player have one archetype that's way better than all the other archetypes, and therefore their value seems a little bit inflated because, like, let's say you have maybe an offensive lineman, for example, that has, like, this is a decent example. Trey Turner has 82 as a power blocker, but only 77 as an agile blocker. So his value, I would say, isn't necessarily an 82, even though Madden would think that that is the case. That's the way their formula counts it. So we're building on that video from last time because I got a comment in the comment section on that video from, I believe his name is Johan Harma or Johan. I apologize if I pronounce your name incorrectly, but he said, "Thanks for this. For someone that lives in a country with a different kind of football, which means I didn't grow up with the NFL, could you please list the positions aside from quarterback where not all archetypes are equally important? And should one upgrade, or should players be upgraded more evenly, or you know, you guys kind of get the point. Should you upgrade them evenly, or should you focus on one specific archetype at a specific position?" So the point of today's video, I apologize for the long introduction, is going to be to go through every single position and discuss with you guys the archetypes, which archetypes matter in terms of player value. You know, do they all matter? Do you only want to focus on one archetype or another? And things like that. So we're going to start on the offense. We're going to talk about the skill positions first and then go from there. So we're actually going to talk about quarterback first because quarterback is one of the easier ones. Pretty much from a quarterback perspective, you're going to, it's going to be dependent on how you're aiming to play the game with that quarterback. So Kyler Murray, for example, you know, if you're aiming to play the game as a mobile style quarterback, you're going to weigh the improviser and scrambler traits higher than the strong arm and field general traits. Now, the way that I play quarterback is I like to be able to beat the defense in any way possible. And so from a Kyler Murray perspective, having him on my team, a guy that can both run and pass the football, I'm looking at a more overall type of average between all four of the archetypes. I would like him to ideally have very good improviser, scrambler, strong arm, and field general archetypes. To me, that is valuable. But if you're playing with a Lamar Jackson type of player, you might only care about improviser and scrambler. So what I do want to say is that some of this is up to your interpretation, and some of this is up to the way that you're going to play and the way that your offense plays and the way that your player plays. So you might not care about, with a Lamar Jackson type of player, the strong arm or the field general type of traits. That might just be how you play the game. However, there are some quarterbacks in the game, obviously, that are immobile, guys that are just going to sit in the pocket and aren't going to be able to run around the way that you know, a Kyler Murray or a Lamar Jackson would be able to run around. So if we look at maybe a Sidney Hoskins type of guy in our franchise that was drafted, he's not a very mobile quarterback, and so if I had this guy, I would be weighing his player value based on his strong arm and his field general attributes. I wouldn't be weighing him as an improviser or a scrambler because he just simply doesn't fit that profile. He's not very mobile, and therefore I'm not going to take those factors into account when I determine their player value. And so keep that in mind when we go through the other positions, that it's not always going to be 100% this is what matters and this is what doesn't matter, because a lot of it's going to depend on how you play the game. Another great example of this is actually going to be the running back position, where I show you guys that it's going to be completely dependent on how you want your running back to play the game. And so from a all-around perspective, if you wanted your running back to be a dual threat in the passing game and the running game, you would want your elusive power and receiving back numbers to all be good. However, in my opinion, the receiving back number isn't very important in the game. It is nice to have a guy like a Christian McCaffrey who is just a very, very good receiving back. However, I noticed that as a running back going out for passes, you don't need to have any extra skill set to be able to do that. You don't need to have high catching numbers. You don't need to have high route running, high release, or anything like that. And so I would generally say the receiving back stat, the receiving back archetype, you can kind of throw away, because most of the running backs in the game that are going to be good for you guys, they're not going to have good receiving back stats. And so I could probably go through and show you guys some of those. You know, a lot of these players up top will probably have good receiving back stats, but I doubt a guy like Derrick Henry does. And so you guys aren't going to say Derrick Henry's not a 90+ overall value player just because his receiving back stat is a 70. So that is one of those stats that doesn't necessarily matter for you. But if you want to have a player that is a receiving back and those stats matter more to you and the way that you play, then that might affect your specific playstyle. Now, as you guys know, I had Devin Singletary in this franchise. I did really well with him in the receiving game. I would have a few hundred yards every single year. I had never had problems with him dropping balls, and he only had a 76 at the receiving back stat. And so I didn't really factor that into his player value. However, what I did do was I factored in the elusive back and the power back ratings to give me more of an average of what I think the player was actually worth. And so, you know, you can kind of get an idea of that by just looking at his stats. He wasn't the best power back because he is a little small and he doesn't have the best trucking in the world, but he was decent at it. And he was a very good elusive back. He could break tackles, he could juke and spin and take people's ankles very nicely. And so I would rank him as somewhere at like a 90 overall type of player, because he's kind of in the middle between that 94 elusive and that 86 power back. And I would kind of drop off that receiving back rating because it doesn't matter a whole lot. You could be a Christian McCaffrey and have the 99 receiving back, but does that really matter that much? Not necessarily. You will notice a difference with a guy like Christian McCaffrey. He will make grabs that no other running back will make. He'll be like a wide receiver, but there are very few running backs that are like that in the game, so I don't generally value the receiving back archetype. Alternatively, you can have a guy that is a dedicated receiving back, which is not necessarily a bad thing. Just keep in mind that for most running backs, those stats aren't going to be as important. And then at the receiver position, this is going to be kind of dependent on how you play the game. You know, generally speaking, these ratings should all kind of coincide with each other, and I don't know why I scrolled over to the right. But for the most part, you're going to want your guy to have a good balance between route runner, slot, and deep threat, in my opinion. I like to have a guy that can kind of do all of those things. It is difficult to have a high rating in the physical archetype. That's just something that I've noticed, and so I wouldn't necessarily take that into account when considering my players overall. So from the wide receiver perspective, like Cooper Kupp here, for example, I would consider him to be a high 80s player. I wouldn't really take into account the physical archetype very much, if at all, and I would kind of average out the route runner, the slot, and the deep threat archetypes and say that is what his true player value is. Like I said, it's really difficult to become a physical wide receiver. I do actually have one on the team. Jalen Hurd is a physical wide receiver. But generally speaking, if you have a high physical rating, your other ratings aren't going to be far behind. So as you guys can see with Jalen Hurd, the gap between his physical archetype and his other archetypes is really not that big of a gap. But what you will see, much like the difference in running back, where you'll see a big gap between their top stat and their receiving back stat at wide receiver, for the most part you'll see a big gap between their top archetype and their physical archetype, because the physical archetype is kind of irrelevant at the wide receiver position. Don't get me wrong, it is nice to have a physical wide receiver because they can just body up and make catches and power past people, but it's not necessarily the most useful in terms of determining a player's actual value, so I would drop that one off. In terms of tight end, like I said before, this is going to matter a whole lot based on how you actually play the game. I like to have a balanced tight end. I like to have a guy that can both receive the ball and block. And so, in terms of receiving the ball, possession and vertical threat kind of go hand in hand, generally speaking. If you're good at one, you're good at the other. You'll see stats very similar like this, where if they're a good possession tight end, they'll also be a good vertical tight end. Very rarely will you see a difference between those two. And so, if you're evaluating your guy as a receiver, those are the stats that you're going to want to look at. And then in terms of blocking, you're going to want to look at that as well. But I would say a lot of tight ends in terms of blocking aren't going to be quite that good. So honestly, you can probably weight the blocking stat a little bit less for the most part. I actually do have a dedicated blocking tight end on my team where he's an 81 blocker, and I wouldn't consider him an 81 overall. I wouldn't consider his value to be that high. You have to consider the fact that he really can't catch the ball. He's not very good in that category. He's not very fast. He can't stretch the field. He's a dedicated blocker, so that brings his value down. Traditionally, people might say, oh yeah, well, he's an 81 overall superstar. That's what his value is. Well, to me, his value isn't that high. He's probably more of like a 75 overall player if you really take all of these things into consideration, because yeah, it's really nice to have a good blocker, but it kind of sucks to have a tight end that just can't catch the ball. So keep that in mind whenever you're evaluating the tight end position, that the blocking stat isn't as important, I would say. The blocking archetype isn't as important when you're evaluating a player's value. Generally speaking, you're going to want to be looking at that possession and vertical threat to determine their value, just because of the way Madden plays this year, though it is nice to have a dedicated blocker as a tight end. So don't ignore the blocking stats, but just know that it's not as important necessarily. Now, when we talk about offensive line, it's going to be basically the same for all of these guys. It can vary a little bit. Traditionally speaking, you want your center to be a run blocker, you want your left guard and your right guard to be more of an agile type of player, and you want your left tackle to be a pass blocker. Your right tackle could either be a pass blocker or a power type of guy, a run blocker. That's just kind of the general idea of how football works. The guard is going to be one-on-one with a defensive tackle, so he has to be able to body that guy up. The guards are going to be going downfield and blocking linebackers, or pulling around and blocking linebackers and defensive backs, so they have to be a little bit more agile. And then your left tackle is traditionally your pass blocker to protect your quarterback's blind side, and your right tackle additionally has to be decent at pass blocking and has to be decent at run blocking, because if you're going to run the ball, oftentimes teams run behind their right tackle. Now that's just a traditional football sense. You don't necessarily have to go by that, and certainly whenever you're scheming up your team, most schemes don't actually appear that way. It's going to be something like this, where most of your offensive linemen are going to be the same type of archetype as their main one. So like my left tackle is a pass protector, but everyone else here is agile. And it's pretty much the same for all the other ones. Like in here, they're all pass protectors and so on and so forth. And so you have to consider what you're trying to do with your team in order to really value your offensive linemen. But what I would caution you about is, for the most part, you want these guys to be well-rounded. You don't want a offensive lineman to just get blown up in the pass game, because then teams will target that and they'll know, okay, well, if my right guard can't pass block, just line up a guy against him in a blitz or something like that and blow him up. Or if my center can't run block, then I'm just going to go at the middle of the field. I'm going to go at the middle of the line and cause problems for the running game up the middle. And so you want these guys to be relatively balanced. And so generally speaking, when I value offensive linemen and I decide which archetypes matter for my offensive linemen, I consider all three. They are all very important to me. I want my guy to be a good power blocker. I want him to be a good pass blocker, and I want him to be agile, because that means he's going to be able to do everything that I ask him to do, because I ask all of my offensive linemen to pass block. I ask all of my offensive linemen to run block. You know what I'm saying? Like, there's no point in the game where I'm just going to say, okay, my left guard doesn't have to pass block, or there's no point in the game where I'm going to say, okay, my right tackle doesn't have to run block on this play. You know what I'm saying? So these guys need to be more well-rounded. You know, that's why I kind of had the first video where I discussed, you know, you don't want to overvalue a guy and say, okay, well, he's a good power blocker, but he's not a good pass protector. You know, he is still a 76 overall. You know, no, I would say that this guy is more like a 74-ish overall player because he's not a very good pass blocker. He's a decent run blocker, but, you know, that pass blocking stat brings him down. I need him to be able to do both things. I need all my offensive linemen to be able to do both things and play both ways, and so that's important. A good example of a balanced lineman here is Alexander Bradley, and this is exactly what I look for in an offensive lineman. I don't need a super high overall offensive lineman. I just need a guy that can do everything that I ask him to do somewhat effectively, and that is exactly what Alexander Bradley is. He's got very good run block stats, good pass block stats, and good agility. He's a well-rounded offensive lineman. This is what you guys want to look for in an offensive lineman, especially if you can find a guy like this that is young, and then you can develop them into a star lineman for you. This is kind of the ideal that you want to have as an offensive lineman. So if you guys are ever wondering what you need at an offensive line position, just take a picture of this. This is a strong player, has good stats across the board, good agile stats, good speed, good agility, good acceleration, you know, basically everything you need out of a lineman, and then I can develop him because he's only, was he 22 years old? I can develop him into a really nice lineman for me. So keep that in mind when you're developing your offensive lineman or picking who you want to progress as your offensive lineman. You know, a lot of times with my offensive line, I'll see things like this where a guy is, you know, a higher overall at a specific position, and so what I'll do is I'll say, okay, well, his pass block's a little weak. You know, I'm comfortable with where his run blocking is, and so I'll pour some of his XP points into his pass block to kind of catch up his lower rating, his lower archetype, because they are all important for the O-line. Enough about the O-line, though. Let's go ahead to the defense and talk about some of these things. And things here get a little bit more complicated. So let's actually start at the secondary positions and talk a little bit about those, and then we'll come inside to the front seven and discuss those things. Like I said, most of these are going to depend on how you play the game and what you want your specific players to be doing. But from a traditional standpoint, your free safety is going to be the cover guy. And so when you're really evaluating what your free safety's value is, you're going to really want to consider their zone and hybrid ratings, because that's going to determine whether they cover or not. The zone rating is as it says, it's the zone coverage rating. That, you know, your safety is going to be in zone coverage a majority of the time, and the hybrid rating is their man coverage rating. Your safeties will from time to time be in man coverage. I really like to have a really good hybrid safety. I love to be able to put a safety in man coverage on a tight end or a wide receiver, because that frees me up to do so many different things. That frees me up to blitz a linebacker or blitz a corner, you know, and give different looks to the offense that can confuse them. And so I like to have hybrid safeties. Now, what I will also say is don't neglect to have the run support abilities, because your safeties, like I have said multiple times in the past, are your last line of defense. You want them to be able to tackle and hit and be able to come up and help you out when you need them to. So don't neglect those things, but I would say from a free safety standpoint, at least from a free safety standpoint, the run support stat doesn't matter quite as much from a traditional sense. So then we talk about the strong safety, and from a traditional standpoint, the strong safety is the player that's going to be coming down into the box and helping you out in the run game, and that's what you see out of John Johnson. This player is usually a little bit slower, but has good tackling ability, good pursuit, good hit power, and stuff like that, and he's basically just a faster linebacker, a little bit smaller of a linebacker, but a guy that can come down into the box and make tackles and make plays for you. And so from this standpoint, I usually try to have at least one of my safeties, which would traditionally be my strong safety, be more of a run support type of guy. And so if I'm specifically designating this guy as a run support type of guy, I would value him primarily based on his run support stat. Now, if this guy is a run support guy and he's a little bit slower, then I'm going to kind of ignore his man coverage, because as you can see, he's got 85 speed. He's not really going to keep up with anybody, maybe a tight end in man coverage, but he's really not going to keep up with anybody in man coverage. And so therefore, I'm going to take his hybrid rating off the table, because yeah, you know, it would be nice to have that ability to man cover with him, but it's really not necessary. I'm not going to put him in positions where he has to man cover a wide receiver or anything like that, because he's a run support type of safety. So I would value him mainly on his run support and his zone archetypes. That would be my combination of what his value is to my team, because that's the role that he plays. He's more of a run support type of player, and as a run support type of safety, you do need to have decent zone ability to be able to cover over the top if need be. But like I said, man coverage is kind of off the table for a player like John Johnson, who's a little bit slower and isn't going to be a man type of player for me. Then we're going to talk about the corners. You know, for the most part, I value these guys as a straight up combination of all three archetypes. It's good to have a zone, man, and slot ability type of corner. You know, Jalen Ramsey is the perfect example of this. You could play him anywhere on the field and he would be successful for you. That's what I like to see out of my receivers, because realistically speaking, if you're playing a good offense, they're going to move their receivers around. Sometimes their best receiver will be in the slot. Sometimes their best receiver will be outside. Sometimes their best receiver will be away from your best corner, and you have to be able to match up against that. And so if you're you know, leaning towards one or the other, then you're kind of handicapping yourself. If you have a 97 man-to-man corner, but he only has 80 zone, for example, that's fine, and you might just value him based on his man-to-man, but that means that you pretty much just have to run man coverage. And so that, like I said, this is going to be one of those positions where it's dependent on how you play the game. If you play the game where you only run man coverage or you only run zone coverage, then that's fine. Then you would value them pretty much solely on that stat. However, I like to mix it up. I like to run both man and zone, so I'm going to value these guys on a combination of these things. Now, the other factor that is at play here is the slot corner archetype. And the slot corner archetype is going to be essentially their ability to kind of stop the run. I don't know if that kind of makes sense to you guys, but a slot type of corner is going to be somebody that actually has decent tackling, is able to get off of blocks, and able to hit. So like with Jalen Ramsey, he's got 80 tackling and 81 hit power, which is really nice to have for a corner. Now that's not all that plays into the slot. The slot is going to be, you know, still somebody that's covering a wide receiver, but they're going to be in more of a run-stopping type of position, so it's going to be a combination of those factors. And so I like to have at least one guy on my team that can do that. Generally speaking, try to keep you know, you're going to have a slot corner on your team, which is generally going to be your third corner. Don't put a guy in the slot that isn't going to be effective as a slot corner. And so, you know, David Long here is a decent example of that. He's a good man-to-man corner, you know, a half-decent slot and a half-decent zone corner, but for the most part, I would be putting him out of position by doing anything other than man coverage with him, which kind of stinks, you know. He only has 70 zone coverage, which means he's not going to be very good at it, and he's only got 58 tackling, you know, very bad block shed, only 50 hit power. It really wouldn't be a good idea to run this guy as a slot corner. Now, you might need to do that out of necessity, but keep in mind that his value is kind of hampered by the fact that he can only run man-to-man for me. And so in terms of me valuing this player, I would look at him and say, okay, well, you know, Madden says he's a 77, but he's really not a 77 value to me because he can only do man coverage. And I need a guy that can do man, I need a guy that can do zone, and I really would also like him to play the slot because realistically speaking, if I have Jalen and Garyon Conley on the outside, the only place this guy's going to play is in the slot, and so that presents a little bit of a problem for me. So that's how I value my defensive backs. Now let's go ahead and talk about the front seven. Let's talk about the linebackers, for example, or first, I should say, is the way I wanted to say it. This is going to depend on whether you run a 3-4 or a 4-3. Generally speaking, if you're running a 4-3, all of these guys are going to be valued virtually the same. These are all coverage, roaming type linebackers that are going to come in, make tackles, and cover in zone. And so you're going to want to evaluate these guys based on their combination between field general, run stopper, and pass coverage. That's all going to be very important for those players. Now, your outside linebackers are going to have speed rusher stats, power rusher stats, and stuff like that. And so, like, what I want to show you a great example of here is Montez Sweat. Montez Sweat is a very imbalanced player. He is not an ideal 4-3 outside linebacker, because what's going to happen here? He's got 87 speed rush. Yeah, that's great. Madden says that as an outside linebacker, he's an 87. And yeah, he is as a pass rusher. I don't know why this is glitching so hard. But as a 4-3 outside linebacker, his true value is a combination of his run stopper ability and his pass coverage ability right there. So he's really only like a 70, like a low 70s overall player, like a 75 maybe, in terms of his true value as that type of position. And so those are the things that you really need to consider whenever you're looking at a player's true value. As a 4-3 outside linebacker, he doesn't hold a lot of value, but as a pass rusher, he does hold a lot of value. He's got 87 in his speed rush ability. And so you want to consider that. As a linebacker, I like to realistically have a good combination of all of these things. I signed Montez Sweat this season as pretty much purely a pass rusher, and then I user him a little bit because he's fast. And so I can kind of make up for the fact that he has horrible zone coverage and bad block shedding and stuff like that. But if I typically want to have a linebacker be able to do all of the things that he needs to do, which is, you know, stop the run, cover in the pass game, I'm going to need a little bit more balance. And so I'm going to want a guy like Reuben Foster that's a little bit balanced across the board. He's a good field general, good run stopper, and good pass cover player. He's not great in any one of these areas, but he's at least got decent stats. That 77 zone coverage, 79 block shed, you know, 86 speed, decent strength, decent play recognition, decent hit power and tackle, that's going to be a really nice combination. That's going to be a really good linebacker. He's not a super high overall, but his value is very nice. And, you know, if I tried to put Montez Sweat into that type of role, he would probably play poorly, and his value is less, but his value is higher as an edge rusher. Samson Ebukam is a guy that is a little bit more balanced, that can kind of play across the board. He's a 92 speed rusher, which is really nice to have, but he has a higher value across the board, as well as a run stopper and pass coverage type guy. So this is a guy that I'm not afraid to say he's got a high value to me, and he can play pretty much any which way that I want him to. Now, again, his zone coverage, his block shed, and stuff like that is pretty low, but his overall abilities kind of make up for that. He's a really nice player, so I like him quite a bit. And so that's what I'm looking for in terms of 4-3 linebackers. I'm looking more for guys that are built like Reuben Foster, that are good field general, run stopper, and pass coverage type guys that can kind of roam around and make plays. Now, from a 3-4 perspective, these guys are great 3-4 outside linebackers, and they hold more value as 3-4 outside linebackers because 3-4 outside linebackers are meant to get pressure on the quarterback. And so Montez Sweat and Samson Ebukam are exactly that, and so I would be weighing them purely on their pass rush and run stopper type of grades, because again, these guys will be involved in stopping the run as 3-4 outside linebackers. Getting on to the defensive line, the defensive ends are very similar to 3-4 outside linebackers, where these guys are going to be valued primarily on their pass rushing ability as a 4-3 defensive end. You know, Aaron Donald, for example, he's a great run stopper, but his true value comes in as an edge rusher, where he can come in and get sacks. The true players that you're going to value more as run-stopping type of players are going to be your 4-3 D tackles. These guys are the guys that you want to really have good run-stopping ability. And so, you know, let's say I took a guy, I don't know, let's say I took a guy like Montez Sweat or Samson Abukum, and I tried to put them at the D tackle spot, they would not hold much value because yes, they can pass rush, but they would never get off their blocks. And so this is what I'm trying to get across. I'm trying to get across to you guys that as a D tackle, your true value and your value, average between your archetypes is going to mainly be focused on your run stopper grade and then one of your pass rush type of grades. So, Eric Armstead, for example, is a more power rush oriented player. So I'm only going to consider his power rusher stat and his run stopper archetype as the combination of what his true value is. I'm going to kind of just ignore that speed rusher stat because it's not really important to me. What's important to me is his run stopper ability and his best pass rushing ability. And then we look at a guy like Damon Harrison Sr., and I say, well, his true value is somewhere between his run stopper and his power rusher, and I ignore that speed rusher stat again. So he's like right around an 80, 81 overall true value to me on my team. And then I'll look at a guy like Jordan Willis, who is a defensive end, and I'm using him personally as a run stopper type of player, but he does add a little bit of value as a power rusher. And so I would say that I would weight most of his ability towards that run stopper grade because that's specifically what I'm using him as in my defense. I'm not really trying to use him as a pass rusher. So I would say that he's more of like a 78 overall player. I'd weight it a little bit more towards that top run stopper archetype because that is what is valuable to my defense and what I'm running and how I'm trying to utilize these players. So hopefully this gives you guys a little bit more idea of which archetypes matter for which positions in terms of trying to determine a player's value and a value to your team, and whether they're useful to you. Like I said, a lot of this is subject to how you play the game, what your schemes are, and what is valuable to you and the way that you play. It's also going to matter, are you using a safety? Are you using a corner? Are you using a linebacker? Are you using a D lineman? That's going to affect whether a player is valuable to you or not. Like I said with Montez Sweat, he's a very imbalanced player, and if I was just letting him go and play on his own, it would be a good idea for me to try and boost his lower archetypes to kind of be on par with his speed rusher archetype. But since I use him as a user player, I don't necessarily need to do that because I can kind of compensate for that. So if this does help you guys out in some way in terms of trying to value players and figure out which archetypes are actually important at specific positions, make sure you guys leave a like on the video, subscribe to the channel if you're new, and comment down below with what you guys would like to see next. I appreciate all your guys' support lately. We've already passed our yearly goal. My goal for the year was 750 subscribers, and we're now, I believe, approaching 850. So you guys are awesome. I really appreciate everything you guys have done for the channel. And like I said, if you guys have anything you need help with, it doesn't even have to be on Madden, any other game, let me know and I'll make a video on it for you and try and help you guys out because I like to cater to you guys because you guys have been very supportive so far. I hope you guys leave a like on the video. Hope you guys have a great night, and I'll see you guys in the next one. See ya.